For hundreds of years, cities grew slowly, stone by stone, street by street, layer by layer above ground. But in 1890, something impossible happened. Entire streets were lifted into the air, not demolished, not rebuilt, lifted. Buildings didn't change, the ground did. Doors that opened onto sidewalks now opened onto basement darkness. Windows that faced the sun now faced packed earth. Storefronts where merchants sold goods now stood behind walls of fill. And no one ever questioned it. Why? Because the answer was buried, right there, beneath their feet, beneath our feet, waiting for someone to ask the question loudly enough. In 1890, entire cities were razed overnight. Not rebuilt, razed. Chicago, Seattle, Vancouver, Portland, Sacramento, Galveston, dozens of cities, same decade, same solution, same silence. As if something below needed to be buried, something that couldn't be destroyed, something that could only be covered. They told you it was for sanitation, but sanitation doesn't explain the doors buried beneath the streets, or the windows leading into darkness, or the maps that showed an empire called Tartaria, and then, one day, stopped showing it. They say it was for sanitation, flood control, modern infrastructure, local solutions to local problems. But that doesn't explain the doors buried 40 feet beneath the streets, or the windows facing packed earth where sidewalks should be, or the storefronts intact with goods still on the shelves, waiting for customers who never came. 1890 wasn't construction, it was concealment. Dozens of cities, one pattern, one silence, one question. What were they so desperate to cover that they lifted entire cities into the air rather than let anyone see what was already there? Most people have never seen this photograph, not because it's hidden, because no one told them to look. It shows a street, not a basement, not a storage space, a street. Storefronts, sidewalks, lampposts, a wooden wheel visible in the background, all of it intact. All of it buried, 40 feet below the modern city. The official caption in the engineering archive calls it excavation for street regrading, but what you're looking at is a city, buried, preserved, forgotten. How does an entire street with buildings, windows, doors, goods on shelves end up 40 feet underground? Someone put it there. That's not an opinion. That's physics. Fill doesn't appear naturally in quantities measured in feet across entire city blocks. Fill is brought. Fill is dumped. Fill is intentional. So the question isn't whether someone buried these streets. The question is why. Here's what the textbooks don't show you. A wave. A wave of grade-raising projects that swept across North America and the world in the second half of the 19th century. Chicago in 1850s raised its streets by as much as 14 feet. Sacramento in the 1960s raised its streets after repeated flooding. Vancouver in the 1880s filled tidal flats and built over what lay beneath. Seattle in the 1890s raised its streets by up to 22 feet. Portland in the 1990s, same pattern, same depth, same silence. San Francisco in 1906 didn't raise streets but rebuilt directly over buried ruins. Galveston in 1900 raised the entire city by 17 feet after the hurricane. The pattern is not subtle. Dozens of cities, same solution, same time frame, same silence about what was actually under there. The official explanation for each city is local. Flooding here, fire there, sanitation everywhere. But for this to be coincidence, you'd need dozens of cities operating in competitive isolation, all independently discovered that their existing ground floors were built at a grade that needed to be raised by roughly the same amount, and that the structures they buried were so unremarkable that no official history ever devoted more than a footnote to describing what was actually under there. Or something else, something they all found, something that required the same response: bury it, build over it, never speak of it. Here's where the official explanation starts to collapse. If these were just basements, just service corridors, just storage spaces, why do they look like streets? Go look at the photographs from Seattle's regrading. You'll see storefront windows with decorative cornices, wooden doors with brass handles, brickwork patterns that match buildings still standing above ground, sidewalks, lampposts, the same architectural language you see in any 19th century commercial district. Now go look at the photographs from Chicago's sewer excavation. Same arched windows, same brickwork, same proportions. Now look at the underground districts in Portland. Same pattern. Edinburgh, Paris, cities across Europe with buried levels. Same architectural features. Same sense that these spaces weren't meant to be underground. They were meant to be at street level. This isn't a theory. This is visual evidence. Hundreds of photographs exist. They're in archives labeled sewer construction, or grade raising, or urban development. You have to know what you're looking for, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. The architectural uniformity across continents is the first crack in the official story. Because if these were local solutions to local problems, why do the buried structures look identical in Chicago, Seattle, Portland, Edinburgh, and Paris? Why do the same arched windows appear, the same brickwork, the same street grids? Local solutions produce local architecture. What we're seeing is the opposite. We're seeing a single architectural language buried beneath cities that supposedly developed independently. Now we have to talk about something that textbooks erased. If you look at maps from the 16th through 19th centuries, you'll see a vast territory spanning Siberia, Central Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe. It's labeled with a name you probably don't recognize: Tartaria. The maps show a civilization, a unified territory, cities, rivers, mountain ranges, borders that stretch across continents. By the late 1800s, the term had vanished, replaced by Russia, Siberia, Kazakhstan, a patchwork of nation-states with newly drawn borders. The official explanation: better cartography, more precise exploration, the natural refinement of geographic knowledge. But here's what the official explanation doesn't address. The maps from before the 19th century depict coastlines and topography with a specificity that shouldn't have been possible without advanced surveying technology. Some maps show Antarctic coastlines without ice, coastlines only confirmed by 20th century sonar.
Where did that knowledge come from? The standard answer, that these maps were copied from older sources, possibly compiled from explorers whose records are now lost, is itself an admission. It admits that there existed cartographic knowledge of territories before the expeditions we recognize as first contact. It admits that someone had been there, had mapped it, had left records detailed enough that European cartographers could reproduce them with recognizable accuracy. It just doesn't ask who. What strikes me the longer I sit with this material isn't the individual anomalies. Any single one could be explained. Any discrepancy, any buried storefront, any vanished map taken alone, manageable, historical noise. It's the pattern. Not the grade raising alone, not the buried structures alone, not the vanished maps alone, not the suppressed reports alone, not the architectural uniformity alone. All of it together, pointing in the same direction, across a century of urban development, across cities with no centralized planning authority, across languages and archives and municipal governments that had every reason to compete and no apparent reason to cooperate. And yet, cooperating, or at least converging on a single uniform silence. The question isn't who made the decision. Maybe no single person did. Maybe the decision made itself, the way certain truths, if they are large enough and disruptive enough, generate their own institutional gravity toward erasure. Not conspiracy in the movie sense, something slower, more diffuse, something that operates through the ordinary human instinct to protect the version of history that allows everything else to continue functioning. Because if what these excavation crews found was real, if the buried streets were real, if the intact storefronts were real, if the infrastructure was real, then the implications don't stop at urban history. They ripple backward through everything, every timeline, every assumption about the age and origin and reach of human civilization, every map, every founding myth of every city that raised its grade and built on top of what came before. Let's talk about the people who actually did the digging. The rate of psychological distress among 19th century excavation crews is not widely discussed in mainstream historical literature, but it's documented. Workers on Chicago's sewer project were described in city records as suffering from what supervisors called excavation sickness, a broad diagnosis covering everything from decompression-like symptoms to episodes of acute agitation when confronted with what they'd uncovered. Some of these workers described streets, sidewalks, buildings with goods still inside, storefronts that looked like they'd been abandoned yesterday, not centuries ago. Now, I know what the rational response to that is: the psychological strain of manual labor, the disorientation of working below grade, the natural tendency of exhausted men to exaggerate what they've seen. But here's what I keep returning to. The descriptions these workers gave were not random. They weren't generic fantasies of lost cities. The architectural details that survived in private letters, in unpublished reports, in the one or two accounts that made it into print before being quietly discontinued, those descriptions have a specific character. Uniform construction methods, non-local materials, layouts suggesting not individual buildings, but planned developments, grids, infrastructure designed at scale. One worker wrote in a letter to his wife that he had stood on a buried street 40 feet below the current city and seen a row of storefronts, windows intact, doors closed, as if the owners had simply locked up and walked away. He wrote that he had reported it to his foreman. He wrote that he was told to keep digging and not to speak of what he'd seen. He wrote that he did not strike that from the letter. The letter was donated to a historical society by his descendants in 1952. It has never been cited in any academic paper. The society's catalog lists it under personal correspondence, unprocessed. Before we wrap this up, I need to show you something that makes this whole thing impossible to dismiss. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, it shows the coastlines of South America, Africa, and, this is where it gets strange, Antarctica, with detail that matches sub-ice topography only confirmed by 20th century sonar. And here's the part that really matters. It shows Antarctica without ice. The Orontius Phineas map, 1531, same thing, Antarctic coastline, ice-free, matching modern surveys of what lies beneath the ice sheet. How? How do 15th century cartographers produce maps of a continent that wasn't officially discovered until 1820 and show it without ice that has been there for millions of years? The standard answer is that these maps were compiled from older sources, much older sources, sources that predate recorded history, sources that came from a civilization with advanced maritime capabilities, advanced surveying techniques, and global reach. That's not fringe speculation,
That's the actual explanation given by cartographic historians. They just don't follow it to its logical conclusion. If there existed, at some point prior to recorded history, a civilization operating at a scale capable of worldwide presence, capable of mapping continents with modern precision, capable of construction in extreme environments, then the question isn't whether Antarctica was inhabited. The question is when it stopped being inhabited. And the question after that is why the record of its inhabitation was so thoroughly, so consistently, so erased on a worldwide scale. Not suppressed in one country, not buried by one government, erased across languages, across archives, across the official histories of nations that have spent centuries in competition with each other, and yet somehow arrived at the same silence on this single subject. That uniformity of silence is itself a form of evidence. 3 expeditions to Antarctica in 1840, American, British, French, all returned, all filed reports, all had their geological observations redacted or disputed or never published. Dozens of cities raising their grade in the 19th century, all buried their ground floors, all fell silent about what they found beneath. Maps showing Tartaria for centuries, then suddenly the name vanishes, the territory redrawn, the history rewritten. Every thread leads to the same place, a door that someone very carefully closed. And somewhere on the other side of that door, beneath 20 feet of fill that has been settling for a century, over streets and storefronts that may or may not have been built by hands we have no name for, the answer is still there, waiting. If you've listened this far, you're someone who wants to know what's actually there, not what you're told to believe, but what the evidence reveals when you follow it without flinching. This investigation is ongoing. The documents exist, the photographs exist, the maps exist. The archives, the ones that haven't been quietly closed, are open to researchers who know what to ask for. The question isn't whether something was buried. The question is, why was it buried? And the only way to answer that is to go look. If this resonates with you, if you want to see where the thread goes next, here's what you can do. 1. Go look at the photographs from your own city. Every city has archives. Every city has engineering records. See what you find when you look for buried streets and forgotten foundations. 2. Share this video. The only thing that has maintained this silence for a century is the absence of enough people asking the same question at the same time. That's what we're changing. 3. Subscribe to Jaff Chronicles. Follow the thread, because this is just the beginning. There's more. There's always more. They didn't destroy it. They buried it. Let's dig.